You're good. Welcome, everybody. It's a real pleasure to have with us Chris Eliasmith today in our seminar series. Chris did his bachelor's in systems design engineering from the University of Waterloo, and then he did a master's and PhD in philosophy, the master's in Waterloo and the PhD from WashU St. Louis, was it, or correct? Yes, it was. Okay. And then he did a brief postdoc and then came back to Waterloo as a faculty member in philosophy. And from then on, he has had this amazing career and very inspiring career connecting philosophy, engineering, and neuroscience. He is the founder or co-founder of the Center for Theoretical Neuroscience. He's a Canada Research Chair in Theoretical Neuroscience, and he has won multiple awards and written 2 books, one of which you can find on Amazon, very interesting. And he's also the CTO of a company, Applied Brain Research, that does NeuroAI before there was NeuroAI, I guess. So it's really exciting to have Chris here, and all over to you, Chris. Looking forward to the talk.
Thanks, Suresh. I appreciate the introduction, and thank you very much for the invitation to give a talk today. So what I'm going to be talking about is sort of where my lab is after 25 years of working on the problem of trying to model how the brain functions. And one of the things that we've recently discovered and been putting together over the last probably, 5 to 10 years is sort of a middle level description, if you will, or methods for giving a middle level description of how cognition in particular works. So my goal today is to tell you about that algebra for cognition. And I believe that it is a way of unifying and quantifying biological cognition, which is sort of my general term for all of the cool high-level stuff that happens in brains. I will mention that my focus has been not just on cognitive kinds of models, so perceptual models, other sorts of low-level models are also of great interest, of course, because the brain has all of these things. But you can think of today's talk as a little bit more of an emphasis on some of the more sophisticated kind of behaviors we tend to see coming out of brains, i.e. cognitive behaviors. So if we want to satisfy this goal, I think there are a couple of things that we need to do. So one is we want to take into account all of the work that's happened before. Typically, when people talk about cognitive science, they will distinguish 3 main paradigms that have been sort of used throughout the history of cognitive science. And these include what's often called GoFi, good old-fashioned AI, or symbolicism. So thinking about cognition as a process of manipulating symbols. And then on the other side, there's been a sort of well-known debate between GoFi and NFi, newfangled AI, which is not so new anymore. But these were sort of connectionist neural network types of approaches. And, that sort of turf war, if you will, has been going on since the 60s. And in the 90s, there was a third contender called the dynamicist view or dynamic systems view. And this was also coupled with enactive cognition or embodied cognition. And so that sort of set of ways of understanding cognition and the interaction between the brain and the body and the world for explaining a lot of sophisticated behavior became central for some researchers. But I think in trying to propose a general theory, we really want to capture the best of each of those kinds of perspectives. In order to do that, I think we need a theory that lets us describe the different types of representations that each of those different paradigms tend to use. So these include things like discrete, symbolic type representations, continuous, more map-like representations that can evolve over time, of course, and also probabilistic representations, which in some ways aren't explicitly captured by any of those 3 paradigms. But people talk a lot now about reasoning under uncertainty, and it's something that in the hands of neuroscientists, I think, has always been obvious as a key function and ability of biological systems. And of course, we want to capture those in a way that's consistent with how neural mechanisms work. And one way to demonstrate that consistency is by implementing our models in spiking neurons. So if we can build something that processes representations of uncertainty and generates the kinds of behaviors that we see in biological systems, and it's doing it with spiking neural networks, then we have a reason to think that the mechanisms at the biological level up through the cognitive level are consistent with what we know about biology. So in pursuing this goal, as Suresh mentioned, I've written 2 books, and I want to just quickly talk about what those books discuss. I'm not really going to spend too much time on them by way of getting to a sort of summary of our current perspective on what this sort of algebra of cognition might look like. So the first of these books is called the Neural Engineering Framework, or it's called Neural Engineering, and we now refer to the methods in there as the Neural Engineering Framework. You can see the book on the right-hand side there. And one way to think about this is it's a neural compiler. So if you give me a high-level description of a function that you want and you think is implemented by a neural network, spiky neural network, then using these methods will let you build that spiky neural network. And it's fairly systematically laid out. So we identify 3 principles: a principle of representation. So this basically talks about neural coding. A principle of computation. How do you transform those representations in order to do interesting things? And then a principle of dynamics. How do you perform those transformations over time to implement arbitrary dynamical systems? Because dynamical systems are probably the best way of describing a physical dynamical system like the brain. So ultimately, this lets us provide a set of methods for taking any dynamical system and compiling it into a neural network model, which works with spikes, and it can be at different levels of sort of sophistication in the spiking mechanism. So you could, use simple leak integrate and fire neurons, or you can use more complicated compartmental neurons and so on. But in any case, what this is answering from a sort of theoretical perspective is how the brain computes, right? So if you know what function the brain is computing, then this gives a sense of how you can embed that in the types of hardware, if you will, or wetware, that is evident as the substrate for neural computation. So that critically does not answer probably the question that everybody really wants to know, which is what the brain computes, right? Like, what are the functions that are being computed by the brain such that it has all of these amazing properties that we see? So my second book, which came out about 9 years later, 10 years later, was called How to Build a Brain. And in that book, I try to answer this what the brain computes question, or I should maybe say sketch an answer or provide an architecture for helping to answer this question. And so you can see the subtitle there is it's a neural architecture for biological cognition. And in particular, we call it the semantic pointer architecture, or SPA. So one of the ways that we demonstrated the utility of this architecture was by building a really big brain model called SPAWN. And that stands for semantic pointer architecture. So our method, unified network. So trying to basically build a network, which was, a very initial attempt at a type of whole brain model, very, very minimal in some ways compared to the actual complexity of the brain. But, at the time, it was the world's largest functional brain model. And, our newest versions are actually still remain the world's largest functional brain models. It was well received. It was published in Science. The newest version has about 6 million neurons. So, very tiny compared to most biological brains, but 20 billion connections. So at the time we proposed it, it was the largest recurrent neural network that I think anyone had ever built. It's, still on a reasonable scale compared to some large language models, so like one order of magnitude away from them. That's still a pretty big model. And of course, we did this work about 10 years ago, 13 years ago it was published. And of course, our interest wasn't sort of trying to set AI types of records or solve machine learning problems, but rather to match what was going on in biology, right? So we wanted to make sure that we had lots of biological details. So it's got several different types of neurotransmitters. The anatomy and physiology are all appropriately matched to the different areas of the brain that we take ourselves to be modeling. And most critically, it was functional. So it could actually do things while being biologically plausible. So the 12 different tasks that it's able to do, I just noticed that my model of it isn't running anymore. So it's running over there on the right-hand side, so you can generate these nice visualizations. And the, the different kinds of tasks it can do here, you maybe read some of them, but basically, some of them are decision-making tasks, some are perceptual tasks, some are clearly cognitive tasks, doing things like intelligence testing and so on. And even doing things like instruction following, which is a very flexible type of task. It's kind of hard to call it a single task, if you will, but it's one of the things that we had later versions of SPAWN do. So that's kind of the starting point for what the talk I want to give today, right? So we have the NEF, right, which tells us that if we have some kind of algebra for cognition, then we could use the NEF in order to demonstrate that it works on a biologically plausible substrate. And the SPA actually has some initial sort of movements in the direction of this algebra. So in particular, in the SPAWN model, we use what are called vector symbolic, originally architectures, but should be called vector symbolic algebras. We show how that approach to modeling cognition can be used to model central aspects of cognition, but we feel that it's incomplete. In particular, it had a couple of challenges, and these are really what I'm going to be focusing on today. One is vector symbolic algebras, is typically used by researchers, are good at capturing discrete sort of computer science-like structures. But we also want to do things like model maps. Like we think there are cognitive maps, in the hippocampus and so on. And the question is like, how do you model those? Because their continuous representations are not really discrete in the same kind of way. And we also want to model things like uncertainty. Biological systems are fantastic at dealing with uncertainty because of the nature of the environment that they've evolved in. And so are we able to, perform those same kinds of inferences or understand that kind of reasoning as well? So I want to begin by introducing you to vector symbolic algebras, because I assume this is something that not everyone is familiar with. And essentially, when defining an algebra, there are several different options here, but all of them do the following. They define a binding operator. So this is an operator where I take two vector representations and I combine them such that the result isn't similar to either of the two original vectors that were combined. And of course, I'm assuming a similarity metric here of some kind. So you just think about this as being the dot product. But that's a binding operator, right? So you can think of this as joining or intertwining these two vectors. We also have a bundling operation, which I think is maybe a little bit more intuitive. This is just summation. And so I sum two vectors together. Now I bundle them in some way. And so the output of that bundling operator is going to be similar to both of the inputs, right? If I add an x and y, then it's going to be similar to both x and y in vector space. I need a similarity metric of some kind. And typically, I can define unbinding in terms of binding with the inverse of one of the vectors. Now, there's subtleties here where these different types of operations can change. You don't necessarily have to define one as the unbinding is the inverse of binding and so on. But this gives you a sense of the kinds of operators that you need. So there are different VSAs that people have proposed. Canerva proposed spatter codes, which is basically a binary version. So all your vectors are binary vectors, and you use things like XOR for binding. There's something called HRRs, or holographic reduced representations, which Tony Plate introduced back in the 90s, which I'll be talking a lot more about. Gaylor and collaborators introduced something called MAP, which stands for multiply, add, permute. So you can see that it almost has the names of each of the operators in there. We've proposed one called VTB, or vector transform binding. And all of these are basically satisfying this structure that I've got here. So just to give you a more intuitive understanding of what the binding and bundling operations are, because those are really central to what I'll be talking about, particularly for holographic reduced representations, I've got a nice little picture here, right? So this is going to be the VSA that, well, it is the VSA that we used in the SPAN model and that I talk about in this semantic pointer architecture book. And it's the one that I'm going to be talking about today as sort of the architecture of cognition. If we sort of put different kinds of interpretations on it, use it different sorts of ways, it actually turns out to be more powerful than we originally thought. So what I'm showing here basically is the difference between bundling and binding. So on the top row, we have what it looks like if I take the image of a cat and the image of I think it's a penguin of some kind, and I bundle them. So I just add them together. You can see in the resulting image a little bit of a cat outline and a little bit of an outline of the penguin, right? So the bird and the cat are kind of both there. So bundling is preserving similarity to both of the inputs. On the bottom row, we're doing exactly the same thing with X and Y, but we're binding them. So the first image is the bound version of the cat and the penguin. And that looks nothing like either the cat or the penguin. If you did the dot product, it wouldn't look similar. If you move over one image, that actually looks similar to the penguin in the sense that there are basically, dark blobs and light blobs in the places where you've got dark and light blobs in the original image, right? So you can see you obviously lost information when you went through this binding and unbinding operation, but you can also see why the similarity would be higher there than with the original convolved sort of bound vector. And the same on the last image on the bottom right corner. You can see, the big yellow glow is kind of where the body of the cat is, and the dark areas are where the dark areas in the original image are. And so it's captured something about that original image in the unbinding, but again, clearly with a loss of information. So how do we use these for capturing discrete data structures? And these, I want to caution you to think of these as examples, right? This isn't necessarily the way that the brain captures discrete data structures, but it is a way of taking vector spaces and capturing discrete data structures in vector spaces. And I think a lot of us are used to thinking about neural activity and so on as a kind of vector. So for instance, if we had a blue square and we wanted to capture that, we might encode it in this way, where each of these bold words is a vector, right? So the object vector representation is the bundle of color of blue and a shape of square. And the reason this is interesting is that the object vector is the same dimensionality as all of the input vectors. It's able to distinguish a blue square from a red triangle, right? So it's clear that the way I'm encoding my color and shape information makes it easy to encode different color and shape information. And yeah, it captures issues of systematicity and productivity and compositionality, all these things that symbolicists talk about as being critical for discrete representations in cognitive systems. And in fact, you can extend that kind of thing to any arbitrary data structure, a discrete data structure. So this is what I meant by the kinds of things we tend to think about in computer science. So linked lists, trees, binary trees, graphs, cyclic or acyclic, and so on. So one example of how we might use this in reasoning scenario, I actually did an example model of this back in like 2003, I think, where I was looking at how humans reason with these logical structures, and there's all kinds of interesting psychology to talk about here in the Wason card task. But the question of how we would represent that kind of sort of rule that people might follow, where you tell them, if there's a vowel on one side of a card that you're showing to them, then there's an even number on the other side of the card. Classically, you would represent this as, a data structure where you've got the relation between the antecedent and the consequent. We can capture that same kind of data structure with a vector, right? So this is just like the kind of blue square example. So I've got, a slot for the relation, which is implication. I say that the antecedent is vowel and the consequent is even, right? So now I can represent all kinds of different things in that implication relation. If I switch my vowel and my antecedent and consequent, it has a very different meaning, right? And so we can capture the same kinds of structure that we do in the classical representation. And of course, this was, originally thought to be a big problem for connectionist networks, that if I just took nodes and labeled them vowel, even, and implication, and then connected them all up with some kind of graph, I wouldn't be able to tell what was implying what and so on. Anyways, there's like a history of criticisms of neural networks as not being able to deal with that kind of structure. But once we've encoded in this way, we can, decode it. We can use it in various cases. So we could ask, for instance, what is the antecedent? Because maybe the antecedent is something that I need to know in order to reason using this implication relation. So to ask that question, we can just take that vector, the R vector, which stands for rule, and bind it with the inverse of antecedent. That's asking the question, what is in the antecedent? And then we can basically do some algebra, right? So we can write out, what it means to be binding. The prime there means the approximate inverse, the approximate inverse of antecedent with that entire R vector. We can then notice that the antecedent is going to bind with the inverse, or the inverse of the antecedent is going to bind with antecedent, and they're going to cancel. So we're going to have vowel plus, and then the antecedent combined with all this other stuff, which we can think of as noise, right? So if it's not something that we would recognize as being a valid vocabulary vector, then we can ignore it. And so the outcome then is approximately equal to vowel, right? So it's sort of answered our question. Now, you might be concerned that I swept a lot under the rug by saying, oh, this is noise, we can get rid of it. I'm happy to talk about that more later. It's definitely an important part of these kinds of models, but I think it's a bit of a distraction right now from my main message. So let me just continue. So this is showing, how we can sort of encode rules into these sorts of structures, how we can manipulate those rules. And then, of course, we could use that to do various kinds of reasoning, right? Logical type reasoning and so on. We can also use this in more sort of connectionist types of ways, if you will. So this is an example of an input that we can give to the spawn model. And this is a kind of patterned after a fluid intelligence test called Raven's progressive matrices. And your job as the viewer of this matrix is to figure out what should go in where the question mark is at the end. And so as you look at this, you're noticing patterns, you're figuring out what the pattern is, and you'd figure out what you'd stick in at the very end. Now, this is something that you don't necessarily have a rule in advance for, right? You haven't seen this matrix in the past. And so what you're doing is kind of looking across these pairs of cells in the matrix and seeing what transformation would account for how these cells are being updated over space. And so we have the model do the same thing, but it's representing each of these cells as a structure, right? So you've got a single one, you've got a 1 followed by a 1 to the right, you've got a 1 followed by a 1 followed by a 1 to the right, you've got a single 4, blah, 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 right? And so you can encode each of these cells, and then you can do vector operations across those cells to see if you can figure out the transformation. So if you have the spawn model do that, you'll see the kinds of representations that it's structuring in these little thought bubbles. Everything, of course, is running in a spiking neural network, and this is just a way of us trying to sort of decode what's in different components in this brain model. So, it's clearly using its working memory, it's using its vision system to recognize the inputs, and then when it gets to the end, it writes out its answer. And so it writes 3 5s, which is correct. And you can think of this model as never having seen this before, right? So, and we can give it many different, variants of this type of problem, and it can solve them at the same level of accuracy as a college-educated human. So, this is something that we sort of established as of, 5 years ago, let's say. But it doesn't answer the questions, right? So it doesn't answer this problem of, well, what about continuous representations, things like maps? And we definitely see lots of examples of these. We find place cells, grid cells, and so on in biology. Could we just use a standard vector space, right? Like vector spaces are continuous, so why do we need to worry about some special continuous representation? And the problem is that those standard vector spaces, it's not clear how you capture properties in that space. So the space is continuous, which is fine, but I want like a smear of properties over the space. Like I want to know that there's an object at some location on a map. So the map is a continuous space, but I need to know that certain features are sitting at some location. So we, if you will, we need kind of continuous slots, right? So in the color shape example, we had a color slot and a shape slot. In a map example, we want to be able to put our features anywhere over that continuous space. So the question is, how do we do that? So that brings me to the sort of first extension of the algebra, if you will, the HR algebra. And we call these things spatial semantic pointers. So when we talked about semantic pointers in our spawn model, we would think of those as these discrete types of representations that we could use to do those Raven's progressive matrices. But then when we were thinking about space and mapping and so on, we began to call these a sort of different type of semantic pointer, though ultimately it's all the same algebra underneath. And when we were building those early models, we needed to do things like keep track of order. So one of the things that the spawn model does is serial working memory. So you tell it a list, and it can repeat the list back in order that you told it. And the way that we captured the ordering in the list is basically by picking a vector, which was our slot for first item, and then generating a slot for second item, third item, and so on. And we found that it was easiest for all kinds of reasons to generate those slots by binding the vector with itself, right? So basically the first slot is B, the second slot is B convolved with B, third slot is B convolved with B convolved with B, and so on, right? So we have a very systematic way of generating it. So the length of the list doesn't really matter. We can always generate slots. So that works for discrete slots. But the thing that turns out to be nice is you can actually have fractional K. So instead of just having K be an integer, you can actually let K be a continuous value. And because this is just circular convolution, this binding operator, it is convolution. And convolution in the frequency space is multiplication. And of course, multiplication to a fractional power is well defined, right? And so we can actually say, I want not just a first slot and a second slot, but I want a 1.5 slot. So when we did that, we basically realized that we're essentially representing a particular type of continuous space. It's a Clifford torus. And we can, in a 2D map, basically implicitly encode a location or make a slot anywhere in that 2D map, right? So on the right-hand side, you can think of this as a decoding of a vector, right? Where the vector is going to be generating slots wherever there are objects, right? So at the location x comma y for object number 1, we would generate a slot there and then bind the features of that object with that slot, and then bundle that with the features of every other slot, every other object of every other slot in the map, right? So here we've got two objects, one at minus 0.1 comma 1.8 and the other at 2.6 comma -2. And we've given those identities, we've bound them with the slots at those locations and summed them up. And so we have one vector at the end, which has the same dimensionality as all these other spaces, but it implicitly encodes essentially this map where we've got a function that defines where these objects are on that map. So you'll notice that this is the same type of representation, same dimensionality of vector and so on as what we were using in the original discrete VSAs. And so we can answer questions in the same kind of way, like the example that I showed for the implication relation. We can encode the map that I've got on the left-hand side. So we have foxes, dogs, bears, and a badger, and we build that memory just like I said. So we have one vector, and then we can query it. We can say, what is at, well, so on the top left, we can say, where is the fox, right? And you can see that two locations light up, right? And so saying where is the fox means we take the original representation, we bind it with the inverse of fox, and then we decode the resulting vector, and those are the 2 points in the implicit function that light up. Similarly, we can ask where the dog, badger, bear is. If we ask where's the wolf, which is not something that's in the memory, then you get no output, right? It's just a blank map. Similarly, we can query by location, right? So we could say what is at the location 1.3 comma -1.2, and we if we decode that, then it says, oh, the fox, like all the features that are there are most like fox features, and similarly for all of the other types of animals. Right, so this gives you a sense of how you can encode information. You can query it in different kinds of ways. And this turns out to be quite useful for doing spatial manipulations. So on the left, I have non-neural accuracy, which just means like doing it in the vector space directly. And then the neural accuracy is doing it with a spiking neural network, right? Just to show that these operations are fairly easy to implement in a spiking neural network. So we can query any object, which I showed. You can query missing objects. You can query locations. You can query duplicate objects. You can query regions of the space. So you can kind of put down a big blob. Instead of saying like one specific point, you can say, is there anything in this general area in the map? You can move the entire groups of objects around. You can move single objects while leaving the group mostly unchanged. So when you do that, you can do a really good job of decoding the object you move, but it actually can introduce quite a bit of noise into the remainder of the elements in the group. Yeah, and then you can read out XY locations and so on.
Excuse me, it's just one question.
Yeah.
How much does the accuracy depend on the size of the network? I mean, I know that you had, I forgot the exact number of the network, but it was in the millions. So,
these are way smaller.
how big does the network have to be in order for these accuracy numbers to be this high?
So this is actually quite a small network. So
okay.
Yeah, if I recall, it's on the order of maybe 10,000 neurons or something like that. Yeah, the million neurons is for doing everything that Spawn does, right? Like that's a very, very complicated network. You have more neurons than you have dimensions, but typically it's on the order of like 50 neurons per dimension. And the number of dimensions in the original vector space is usually on the order of 2 to 500. So not that big.
Okay, thanks.
Yep. Okay, so right, so this, we got very interested in this because it seems to be solving that sort of general problem. But it also, as soon as you start thinking about mapping in the brain, right, you begin to think about, well, what do we know about the brain and mapping? And one of the things that we know, of course, is that it looks like spatial information is encoded using hex cells and place cells and border cells, all these different types of cells. So one of the things that we noticed is that you can actually choose the axis vectors however you want. Right, so back here, those x and y, the big x and y in the top equation, we call those axis vectors because they're basically saying, I'm taking some vector and putting it to the power of x, and that some vector is telling me which axis I'm defining my slot along. And then I have a big y that's telling me what axis I'm defining my slot along. And so when we started, we picked those randomly. And we pick them randomly because that's generally how you pick stuff for an HRR. But we don't have to pick them randomly. We can actually pick them with some structure. And in particular, we can pick them so that they have a hexagonal-like structure, right? Which is a very natural one to pick, given what we know about how the brain works. And so this is showing some examples of, comparing a path run in an experiment on the right-hand side and looking at real grid cells to the kinds of grid cells that are generated in our model when you run the same path through a spiking implementation of these grid cells. And you get the kinds of things you want to see, right? So you have different sort of rotations, orientations, different levels of spatial resolution and so on, and you can control those things by the way that you choose those axes. Furthermore, when you take that kind of representation and put it into a model that's actually doing something interesting, in this case doing self-localization and mapping, or SLAM, then you find other kinds of cells that we know from the hippocampus popping up. So for instance, we see things like object vector cells. So these are cells that, regardless of whatever object is near, when it's near an object, right? In this case, when it's to the right of the object, then that cell seems to be active. Or place cells, which of course, are specific to one particular location. All of these types of cells are evident when you build models where the way that you're representing the spatial structure maps what we know about biology. And interestingly, we don't do that just because we know that biology does it. We can actually show that that is a good kind of representation. So let me just give two instances of that. So the first here, this is actually a fairly simple network. And what we're trying to demonstrate here is that representing space using this kind of representation is much better than what people would typically do to represent space in machine learning, right? So we've got this weird nonlinear function of space, which is in the top left-hand corner. You can think of this as a sort of a policy in that maze for how to get to the cheese, right? And so it tells you which direction to go. There's a little legend in the bottom left. So if I was in the top right of the, I'm not sure, can you see my cursor?
No.
No, you can't. Okay. That's why I've been describing everything verbally. But yeah, so in the top right corner of the ground truth, you can see light blue. And if you look at the legend, that means move downwards, right? So then you'd go downwards until you hit the green. The green means move left, right? So then you'd go left and then if you follow that, it will take you to the cheese, right? From any location. So this is a policy for solving this map. So if we represent that policy with a, if we compute the policy by representing space with SSPs, we can actually do a very good job of capturing the nonlinearities there, right? And that's what we see in the second grid over to the right. The rest of the examples are different ways that people would typically do this, right? So you could do a random projection from your 2D space into a higher dimensional space and then try to learn. You could use trigonometric functions to specify those locations. You could do a random mapping. You could do the 2D coordinates themselves. And in each of these cases, you're basically taking that way of representing space, putting it through a one-layer neural network, and then trying to compute this nonlinear function out. And you'll see that SSPs not only have the lowest RMSE, but they capture all of the key nonlinearities, right? So you can actually use it as a map to get to the cheese every time. And on the right-hand side, we're showing that when you do this with hex SSPs versus the original random SSPs, you do a much better job, right? So you have a much lower error when you're using hex SSPs, which suggests why we would expect, or why we see that kind of representation in the brain, right? Because it turns out to be much more efficient than if we just had randomly picked them, even though we could compute the same type of function. So, so this gives us a sense that they're better, but of course, we really want to put this in like fully functional systems. And I kind of alluded to the fact that we've done this for SLAM, self-localization and mapping, and this is just demonstrating that SLAM experiment. So think of this as being an agent going into this environment on the left-hand side. It walks around over that path that you see. By the time it's gone through that path, we can then ask it questions, right? So we can say things like, where's the blue triangle? Where are all the blue objects? Where are the walls? Where are all the triangles? And you can see that it's figured out where all of these things are. It's successfully built a map. And it can also do a very good job of localizing itself. And so this is on the top right here, this is showing the error that it has from localizing itself when it's using this SLAM system. Part of a SLAM system is always a path integrator. And so the blue line is showing if you just had a path integrator and you didn't have this additional SSP memory, how would your localization be? And you can see it's far, far worse. So building up that memory, building up the map, and then using it to help localize actually works really well. And this is running over 500 seconds, so it's quite a long run. And you can see that it's a fairly complicated path through like 100 different objects. So this network obviously is much larger than the 10 to 20,000 neuron one I talked about. This is on the order, I believe, of 200,000 neurons or so. But still really small, right, for the kind of functionality that it's doing, which I think is a good thing. All right, so I think by this point, we had convinced ourselves that these SSPs were really useful for representing continuous data. And so we, while we were looking at these, one of the ways that we were thinking about them is representing implicit functions. And of course, in the context of thinking about probability, that begins to give you hints about how you might represent probabilities, right? Is because probabilities, of course, are typically functions over some space. So we have discrete and continuous representations, but what about representing uncertainty? This kind of representation pops up all the time. Like when we're moving around a map, we're often not exactly sure where we are. We have a sense of where we are, right? And we might have degrees of certainty about that, depending on if our eyes are open or closed, if we've been spun in a circle recently, and so on. Also, if we're doing just generic things like cost-benefit optimization, right? You often need to know how certain are you of the cost, where do you know about the costs and where they happen, what kind of benefits do you get out of different options from choosing different options, et cetera, et cetera. And this kind of problem is typically solved using probabilistic methods, things like Bayesian optimization and so on. So how would we solve those types of problems? Could we use standard probability theory? Typically when people write these sorts of problems down and they build things like Bayes nets and so on, these get very computationally expensive. There is just a lot of, hard compute that has to happen, big multiplications across with really complicated functions, lots of integration, and so on and so forth. So the question is, can we use this way of representing functions to introduce something that is neurally implementable in a reasonable amount, with a reasonable amount of compute and efficient? And so the answer is yes, or I wouldn't have brought it up. So we can use these SSPs to encode and process probabilities in a way analogous, or at least inspired by the continuous representations in general. And the reason this is because when you take the dot product between two of these SSP represented slots, you induce a kernel, right? In particular, you induce a sinc function. And you can show that in the limit, as the dimensionality of the vectors goes to infinity that you're embedding the space into, it is an exactly a sinc function. And a sinc is actually one of the kinds of kernels that people often use for estimating probabilities. So what do I mean when I talk about estimating probabilities? So there's a whole class of estimators called kernel density estimators. What they do is basically, given a particular data set, which has been derived from a distribution in the world, you can use a kernel function to estimate that distribution by basically just summing across all of the kernels. So placing a kernel at every sample point and then summing over them all and then calling that your estimate of the distribution. So here's a bunch of examples of that. So on the left is a Gaussian KDE. And you can see, given the original input, which is in gray in the background, and the kernel above it in blue, you can see what the different estimates look like depending on the type of kernel that you pick, right? So yeah, this is just sort of several examples. And of course, we can do the same thing with a sinc kernel. Of course, what we're not actually placing the kernel down. What we're doing is we're encoding things as a semantic pointer, things being the sample point, and then we're summing across all the sample points. And then when we do that, we can go back and estimate the original probability distribution that would have generated all those sample points. So again, you can see the original distribution in gray in the back. You can see a perfect sinc KDE. So FIE is just a type of KDE in this instance. It's in blue, and the blue is right underneath the orange, which means that basically estimating with a sinc function or estimating with an SSP gives you the same answer, which is what we would expect. Or a radio basis function KDE, right, is just another example of doing that for comparison. And all these black X's along the bottom, those are the sample points that were generated in this particular instance. Now, this is not exactly a probability. And then you do have to do a conversion from the representation in this bundle of all these sample points. And that conversion looks like the following. So to get the estimate of the probability at a point X, you take the max of 0 and M. So M was the bundle that we generated from all the original points. You dot it with the query point, and then you move it around with a bias. So this should look familiar, right? This is basically a ReLU operation. So converting from this sort of bundled representation of the probability distribution to an actual probability requires one ReLU. And just to try to clarify things, basically we have the distribution embedded in the weights in this instance. We have the query point embedded in the activities of the neurons, and then those are biased, and the output activity would be the probability of that sample point. Okay, so we can think of these SSPs as being latent probability distributions. Those distributions are stored in these bundles, right, that we were constructing. We were just calling them maps before, but we can actually just think of them as a sort of generic probability distribution. And we can apply manipulations to the bundles to produce different kinds of probabilistic statements, right? So we saw in the instance just estimating the probability of a sample. We can also do things like conditioning. So given the distribution in the top right corner, right? So this is a two-dimensional distribution, joint distribution. We can do things like condition the probability of X given Y. And this is an inverse binding with the Y value. And then we can decode the resulting probability distribution. And this is basically showing that for a bunch of different condition values. So right in the middle, so this is where the condition value is 0. And so we have a mean right around 0. And then as you go to the right, we're going, basically the conditioning is moving the estimator farther and farther to the right. Or it's taking a slice through the joint distribution farther and farther to the right in the X space. And then to the left is the same thing in the opposite direction. And along the top, we've just listed the error introduced in the estimate of the mean versus the original mean, and they're very small errors, right? So we are doing a good job of actually conditioning the distribution. Right, so this is, again, an example of how we can not only represent the probability distributions this way, but then also do standard sort of probabilistic manipulations, all while staying in this SSP space. So the last example I want to show is one where we're kind of using it for a useful function. And now this is going to be using it for that kind of Bayesian optimization type of problem I was talking about before. And so this paper is in press. Hopefully we'll get it back. It's got to revise and resubmit, so fingers crossed. But in this paper, we are showing application of this type of representation to 3 challenging optimization problems. The first on the left is basically using 2 robotic arms, one small and one large, for picking things out of boxes. And the boxes can be big or small. And so picking the correct arm, depends on the size of the box and all these kinds of things. In the middle, we're doing what we call the belt stretch problem. And this is coordinating 2 robotic arms to take a belt that you're trying to put across 2 pulleys and actually get it onto the pulleys without having flying off into space. And then the last one, we call this PSR, or the permanently shadowed region problem. And here we're coordinating 4 different robots to go into this lunar indent to search for water, right? Where as soon as they go in there, now they're cut off from their power source. And so they have to be very careful about where they sample. And the idea is that they don't know exactly where the water is in this crater, but as they take samples, they get information about how close they are, right? And so you basically are very carefully sampling, actually, as all of these problems, you're basically carefully sampling trajectories in order to give you information about what trajectories to sample next in order to solve the problem of interest. So looking at that PSR example in a little bit more detail, just to give you a sense of what this looks like. Essentially what we have here is a hybrid representation, right? So we have particular agents that are related to particular trajectories. So each agent has its trajectory, and we encode the trajectory as like a bundle of points that the agent's going to go to, and that's our phi sub I in this instance. For each of those agents, we have 4 in this case. We generate a possible trajectory. We can bind it with the agent, and then we bundle them all together, and that's our entire problem solution, right? Is how we move all 4 of the agents in the space. So going from left to right here, right? If we in the sort of hybrid vector decomposed, that you can think of as the implicit function that's represented in our encoded representation that I just described. We can then take that and decode it to give us actual trajectories that we would then drive the robots through. Then the robots will go through those trajectories. see if there's any water there, and give us a reward proportional to how close they think they are to that water. We can then use that reward to run our Bayesian optimization method, generate the next representation in this SSP space. And we can actually do all of these things in the SSP space except for the decoding and running of the robots. And then we've now got another hybrid high-dimensional vector, do the decode, and basically go through this loop over and over again to find the optimal solution to this problem, right? Find the best trajectories. And so we can show that doing this, we do as good a job at solving the problem as state-of-the-art methods. So in red is using BO-Torch, which is a standard library people use to do Bayesian optimization in PyTorch. So we have the box reach, the belt stretch, and the PSR exploration task. And so that's good, right? So we can solve the problems kind of as well as using Bayesian optimization methods generally can. The big payoff comes when we look at the efficiency of this. So here we can see that we're between 50 and 175 times faster at solving these problems because we've reduced what is typically an ON cubed problem to an O1 problem in the number of samples. And the reason is because basically every time we get a new sample, we're just adding it into our memory, and we're only ever processing our memory. Standard BO adds all of those items up and then does big matrix inversions and things, which are just where you get your ON cubed from. So, right, so we can see here, basically on this graph, it looks like the length of time is about 0 for running the optimization method in the SSP space versus doing it the way you usually would. And it's really important, if you were on the moon and you were trying to solve this kind of problem, you're not changing the resource demands regardless of how many data points you're getting and so on, right? You just, it's very predictable from a perspective of the agent, which is really helpful. All right, so this, I think, gives us good evidence that we've got ways of representing, manipulating, and processing probability representations, probabilistic representations that capture uncertainty in a way that is cognitively useful. So that brings me to the end of my talk. So, I think I've given you some examples of how VSAs, vector symbolic algebras, the semantic pointer architecture, and the NEF can give us this unifying quantitative theory that I talked about at the start. It does a good job of integrating symbolicism, connectionism, and dynamicism along with the probabilistic stuff, right? So we can capture representations that are discrete, continuous, and probabilistic, and they're consistent with neural mechanisms. So we've built lots of these models in spiking neurons, showing that we can, and in fact, in the Bayesian optimization paper, we show how we can run that on a neuromorphic hardware on the Louis neuromorphic chip. So that's a spiking chip, right? So again, demonstrating that, yeah, we really can get the stuff right down to the level of implementation. And then the last thing I'd like to just highlight is that as we were going through this, one of the things that occurred to us is that hyperspherical representations are really an important constraint here. And I haven't actually talked about this too much, but you can imagine that if I take a vector and I bind it with itself over and over and over again in the frequency space, it's either going to grow or shrink to 0. Right? The only way that doesn't happen is if we take the vector and place it on the unit hypersphere. And then every time we bind it with itself, or actually on the Clifford torus, every time we bind it with itself, it stays on the torus. So its magnitude stays as 1 in the frequency domain. And so this has really made us think a little bit more carefully about how important it is to have sort of properly normalized representations, or representations which are robust to the kind of manipulations that are important for these algebras. And I can tell a whole story about how hyperspherical representations have been often discovered as an important way of making your machine learning algorithms work better. And, a lot of normalization is, you can think of as doing this and so on. But I think it is useful as a sort of aside or an additional constraint to this algebra that seems like it's popped up over and over again as being really important. So I will stop there. Just quickly give some pointers to some research papers and tutorials and so on, and happy to answer any questions.
Thank you. Amazing talk, very thought-provoking. And Puya has a question.
Yes, hi. Thanks a lot, Chris. It was a great talk. The question I have, you're probably being asked every time you give this talk. I was going to ask you about if you could comment on how you think this VSA in general and SSP maybe in particular, how they're related to attention layers, dot product attention layers, and transformers in general? How are they related? How are they different? Would appreciate it.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, there's another entire sort of stream of research in my lab that looks at using these in large language models. And it's precisely because, you are in these VSAs, you are imposing structure that is very understandable and explainable and manipulatable in very clear ways, which are all things that generally large language models suffer from. And so, yeah, they are in vector embedding. You can map, so some of our recent work, we've mapped, sort of halfway through a large language model, taken those embeddings, mapped them to these VSA embeddings, and shown that massively improves your ability to do structured reasoning in language models. So yeah, I think they are closely related. We haven't looked at things like trying to, just take the representations generated by large language models and decompose them using these operators and seeing if we can find that
That's
kind of
what I was going to ask. Yeah, for ability.
Yeah, we've seen, so people have done that kind of thing for finding out how hyperspherical they are and so on. So, there's a beginning of a connection there for sure. But yeah, we've mostly been looking at it as the way of trying to improve the functioning of these models. We've also demonstrated that it's better for question answering techniques. So people are often encode knowledge graphs and then use those to inform a large language model to improve its question answering. So you can encode, and they use graph neural networks. You can encode those using SSPs or using semantic pointers or VSAs, I should say, in the general case. So you can encode those using VSAs and then get the same kind of performance with faster learning and basically a much simpler network as well. So yeah, I don't know if that helps. As far as attention, yeah. I mean, I've got other things to say about LLMs too, but
if you have any of your papers on top of your mind, which one is the one that you were working with to get the transformer, like a language models intermediate latent space, and then use SSP to improve?
So that paper is submitted to ICLR right now.
Okay.
But it's on archive.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you.
So if you look up my last name and LLMs, I think you'll probably find it. You probably have papers there, but yeah, it should be obviously.
Thanks.
Yeah, no problem.
While we wait, I have a couple of questions. So I was also had a connection question. So how does this connect to these theories of hippocampal grid cells being optimal for spatial representations? You had something that hinted at that. Are they in the same ballpark or?
Yeah, I mean, we actually, so in the paper where we present that result, we cite the paper, the Ganguly paper, where they argue for, this looking like it might be a optimal way of representing place cell. And actually one of the tests we do is showing that, yeah, it is better than the random SSPs. So I kind of think of that as the connection, right? So we don't prove that they're optimal. We show that they do better than all the other methods that we try. And then we can, gesture towards that kind of work for proof. The thing that I like more about it is that it, falls out of this algebra, right? So the thing that we are showing is that, yeah, that thing that we think is optimal is just a natural consequence of this algebra, right? So that's the connection that I see.
Yeah, the other thing was this is longstanding, as you know very well, of course, as this is longstanding idea in psychology of space as a binder, right? So even for abstract tasks that you map onto a space. So is that sort of the idea here as well, that you could, it doesn't have to be physical space, the problem can be abstract, and then you have an abstract space and the pointers are living in that connection? Yeah,
absolutely. When we originally introduced the notion of spatial semantic pointer, we say this is an abstract space. Like, we're not making the argument that this has to be physical space. And yeah, there's, work where they do, show a bunch of different types of stimuli, and some of them, they're a bunch of birds, and some of the birds have long necks and some have short necks. And then they argue that you see sort of grid cell-like representations representing the length of the neck when people are doing classification, et cetera, et cetera. And so 100%, we totally think that this is a general way that the brain represents continuity and try to sort of encode features over continuous abstract spaces. Yeah.
Yeah. So the other thing I was curious about, I have many questions and I'm waiting for someone else as well. So I was wondering where the spikes come into this. What are the advantages of computing with spikes? And because
Yep.
you said that there is the dynamical systems, there's the vector algebra. So where are the spikes coming into all this?
Well, so when you say coming in, the way that I think about spikes is that they are a particularly energy efficient way of executing these computations. So they don't sort of come in from a functional perspective. Like there's not something you can do with spikes that you can't do without spikes. But when you get to the, nitty gritty of how much energy am I using? Am I going to die because I didn't get enough to eat, right? Energy matters a huge amount. Then using spikes to compute these kinds of dynamical systems and vector operators and stuff turns out to be incredibly efficient, right? Especially in the dynamics case, because essentially what spikes are doing is sparsifying information over time. So you're not wasting constantly computing when you don't need to, right? So yeah, ultimately that's the role that I think of. I think they also play a bit of a sort of rhetorical role, if you will, where we can convince people that the mechanisms that can do these computations are the mechanisms you find in the brain, right? So we're not pretending that they can do some, high order, I don't know, multiplication of some kind that would be super difficult to do accurately with neurons. But we're saying, look, we can do it with neurons, and we get all the noise that you get when you introduce neurons, and so you kind of capture the mechanisms a lot better than when you don't do it with spikes, because I think can always be a nagging sort of concern when you present these kinds of models, or that you'd need, it was one of the questions kind of pointed out, like if I need 12 million neurons just to do some simple spatial reasoning, like that's insane, right? We know that doesn't work. So again, you can allay those fears.
So, but your implementations all use spikes, right? So they are spiking your network, so usually.
Yeah, everything I talked about. So the Bayesian optimization stuff I showed, we didn't do that all in spikes. We just did one sort of sample function in spikes, so to run it on the neuromorphic hardware to make that point, basically. But yeah, everything else I showed was all done in spiking neurons. Yeah.
Right.
Like
Go ahead. Sort of question from someone.
There might be some in the chat. Like,
no, that was just Puya.
Oh.
So the trade-off of using this sparsification is that you then have to collect the information together, right? So the spikes are occurring at discrete times, and you need to put it together, right? So.
Yeah, I mean, yes. So I think like the putting it together, if I'm understanding your question, is basically happens on a neuron by neuron basis, because they filter your spikes with a postsynaptic potential or current, and so they smear that information over time for you, right?
Right. And so in your implementations, do you find representations then? So we go back to the old question that we came to. So is there any need for what's your position there? Are they just convenient abstractions, or do they exist and you can't find them, or they're constantly changing?
What is sorry? It was what there?
The notion of representations that as a neuroscientist looking at the brain, you try and find. So when you implement them in spiking networks, so there is an algebra being computed, but how does it connect to the representations that you can see?
So that's what the NEF is basically trying to describe, is the relationship between the low-level neural representations, if you will, and the sort of mid-level vector space representations. And I think there's lots of evidence that that is a reasonable way of talking about biological systems, because you can go backwards. Like a lot of people nowadays are collecting huge amounts of data across lots of different electrodes, and then trying to discover the low-dimensional dynamics of that big data set, right? And that wouldn't work if you didn't have some high correlation between all the activity going on across all these electrodes. So yeah, so I think that's kind of something that the NEF just assumed would be true, and it turns out that people really can extract that kind of low dimensional manifold.
Okay, great. Thank you very much. That was fantastic, very interesting, and we have to do a lot of thinking and learning about this. Great, thank you.
My pleasure.
Great. Okay.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye-bye.